Shundron Thomas is the president of Northern Trust Asset Management and joins us now. Shundron, good morning.
Good morning.
So I think it's interesting in your open letter, part of it, you mentioned specifically Jesus's parable of the lost sheep leaving the 99 to go after the one. And you talk about the need for support for essential workers, lower income workers, families with special needs. In a dollars and cents perspective, how do you think that businesses should apply that?
Well, the reason I think it very much applies to dollars and cents, it starts with this thought of compassion. Compassion means to struggle together or with, right? And so appreciating that our fortunes, economic and otherwise, are tied together. And so I think there's sometimes a perception that if we're focused on the needs of people outside of our immediate community or outside of our immediate circle of influence, that's not impacting us. But the reality is, if you look at the potential in our communities, it's undertapped. And a lot of it is because of the inequities that we see. And I think this pandemic has exposed many of those. And so that's one of the reasons of the focus and the encouragement on this kind of leadership that we need, particularly at this time.
Now, you mentioned kind of the potential of a disconnect. Yeah, the Dow's down 400 points today, but in general, the markets have been soaring at a time when the experience of people on Main Street has been very different. There is this disconnect, it seems, between what investors are experiencing and what people in the real economy are experiencing. How does compassion address that, or how should it?
Well, one of the ways I think it addresses it is a very simple term, which is equity, right? And so if you think about equity on two angles, one, equity is equal access to opportunity. But two, equity is actually a reflection of ownership. And so one of the reasons we have a disconnect is so many of the people that we think about across society don't actually have true ownership equity. Beyond that, when we think about access to opportunity, we think about living in a wonderful land of opportunity. But one of our realities is access to that opportunity is not equitable. And so one of the things that we need to do, both for those that are disadvantaged or most impacted by this, but also for the growth of the overall economy, is we have to even the playing field. We have to make access to opportunity more equal. And most importantly, we have to move from a simple focus on charity. You actually focus on charity many times when you haven't put in place equity, to focusing on equity. And what that means to me, for example, the focus on Black communities, investing in those communities with people in the communities, in businesses there, to create the kind of equity that lifts not only those communities, but our economy as a whole and our communities as a whole.
Shundron, Julia here. I'm wondering if you could give me a sense of whether there are any leaders right now who you see doing an exemplary job of this, people who you would point to, or practices you see being adopted by certain corporate leaders that you think others should adopt.
Well, one of the things I would point to is more so a group of leaders. So one of the things before we get to the crisis, if you think back in 2019, there was a lot of robust conversation about the purpose of a company. And so a group of esteemed corporate leaders representing many of the largest companies in the world, right, actually redefine that, moving away from a singular focus, right, on just increasing shareholder equity or shareholder returns to thinking about all of the different stakeholders and even how we ethically do business within our communities. Now, some people look at that cynically, but I think of that as being very positive. And then you can talk about specific instances of that being played out. I think the last thing I would say is this pandemic, this crisis which has been presented to us, actually presents the opportunity to make, in a sense, the promise of what we say there in terms of that refound or refocus on purpose a reality.
Shundron, I do want to talk about the markets. Your perspective from Northern Trust, very much needed here, I would say. What do you say to people who are maybe thrown for a loop by the swings in the market, wondering what to make of fixed income these days, which isn't paying much, wondering where to find stability and where to find, I guess, a different kind of opportunity in the markets?
Right. So the first thing I think about is, one, you have to think about investing over the long term. Two, the markets actually provide for us a good deal of insight. So one, if we look at the equity markets, while certainly they have recovered well, you continue to see a good deal of volatility. That tells us something about, in a sense, the behaviors, the sentiment of investors. One of the things I'm paying very close attention to is actually what's going on in the fixed income markets. And so we see not just today, but over the most recent weeks, stubbornly low interest rates. So that does tell you something about at least the perception of fixed income investors who tend to look more at macro issues in terms of where we are in sorting through some of those issues. I think the practical reality for long-term investors is you want to be invested over the long haul. I would tell you in terms of our disposition, we have in recent weeks, in the last month and a half, took some of our risk exposure off of the table, so we're more neutral. And so that gives you a clear sense of how we're seeing the immediate market environment, including where valuations are at this particular point.
Is that more of a call on where valuations are right now, and perhaps you're expecting an opportunity to get back more into equities at a lower level, perhaps? Or is that something else? Are you perhaps looking at putting that capital into, I don't know, emerging markets, which a lot of people are saying they want to stay away from, or some other area?
Yeah, for us, it's actually how we think about investing. So one of the things that we say is it's important in all environments for investors to be compensated appropriately for the risk that they take. So for instance, I'll give you one example. In portfolios, we're looking more towards lower volatility stocks, and we're also looking more to higher quality stocks. Because, again, that's reflected what we think is the risk return in the market environment. So it's not simply about valuations. It's about how to appropriately position the portfolio in the kind of environment that we have and with the attendant risks that we're looking at.
All right. Chandran Thomas, Northern Trust Asset Management President, with some valuable insight with the Dow down more than 400 points, about 2%, and the S&P down about 1 2/3. Thank you, Chandran, for being with us.
Thank you.